It was the first Thanksgiving since Grandma passed, and the table felt emptier than ever. Her chair sat at the head of the table, untouched, as if no one dared to claim it. Mom, teary-eyed but smiling, insisted we set a plate for her anyway. It's a tradition, she said. The rest of the family filled the house with the usual chaos. Uncle Ron arguing politics, kids screaming over who got the biggest slice of pie, and Dad carving the turkey like it was a war zone. But there was a strange heaviness in the air, something I couldn't quite shake. As we were about to sit down, the doorbell rang. I frowned. Who could it be? Everyone we'd invited was already here. "I'll get it," I said, eager for an excuse to escape the noise. When I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. There she was, Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan, who had vanished without a trace 7 years ago. She looked unchanged. Same red coat, same neat curls, same warm, crinkled smile. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice as sweet as ever. "Am I too late?" I was frozen, my mind racing. We'd searched for her for years. Private investigators, police, everything. No leads, no closure. And yet here she stood, as if nothing had happened. Come in," I stammered, stepping aside. The room fell silent as Susan entered. Plates clattered, voices hushed. Mom dropped her wine glass, the red liquid spreading like a stain across the floor. "Susan," Mom whispered. "Happy Thanksgiving," Susan said, her voice calm and steady. She hugged Mom, who was trembling, and then moved around the table, greeting everyone like she had just been on a long vacation. No one said anything, but everyone was staring. Dad looked pale. Uncle Ron clutched his beer tighter, and the kids hid behind their mom. I finally found my voice. Where have you been?" Susan tilted her head, as if confused by the question. "Oh, here and there. But I'm home now, aren't I? That's what matters." She sat in Grandma's chair, the one we'd kept empty, and smiled at the plate set before her. We tried to eat, but no one could really focus. Susan didn't seem to notice. She talked about memories from past Thanksgivings, funny stories, and Grandma's pumpkin pie recipe. Her voice was cheerful, but something about her words didn't sit right. She mentioned things that happened after she disappeared. "Do you remember last year when Grandma's turkey caught fire?" she said with a laugh. She was so embarrassed. The table went dead silent. That happened last Thanksgiving, years after Susan was gone. "How do you know about that?" Mom asked her, her voice shaking. Susan blinked. "Grandma told me, of course." She looked around at our horrified faces, then chuckled. "Oh, don't look so shocked. She's doing well. She says she misses all of you." I felt ice crawl up my spine. Grandma, who had died. "I think you should leave," Susan said, suddenly standing up. "It's getting late." "No!" Mom cried, reaching for her, but Susan was already at the door. She turned back, her smile fading. "Take care of each other. You'll see us again soon." And then she was gone, out the front door. We were all stunned in complete silence and were absolutely horrified. Mom burst into tears. Dad muttered something about needing air, and Uncle Ron started saying prayers under his breath. I looked down at Susan's plate, the one that had been untouched. Except it wasn't. Her wine glass was empty, and a single bite had been taken from the turkey leg. Thanksgiving at my friend Mia's house was supposed to be my escape. My parents were fighting, again, and the thought of spending hours trapped in the tension-filled dining room was unbearable. Mia's family had always been warm and inviting, and she didn't hesitate to invite me to join them for dinner. Her house was tucked away in the woods, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The long gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the house. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and I could hear faint laughter inside. Mia met me at the door with a grin. "You're just in time. We're about to eat." The smell of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and pumpkin pie hit me as I stepped inside. The dining room was beautiful. Candles flickered in the center of a massive wooden table, and her family, all smiles, were already seated. "This is Kayla," Mia said, introducing me. Her parents, grandparents, and a few cousins greeted me warmly. Mia pulled out a chair for me, and I sat between her and her younger brother, Lucas. Dinner started off as perfect as I'd hoped. Everyone was laughing, passing plates, and sharing stories about past Thanksgivings. But as the evening wore on, I started to feel strange. It wasn't the food. I barely touched it, suddenly uneasy. It was the people. Mia's family was friendly, sure, but their laughter felt just a little too forced. Their smiles stretched a little too wide, and their eyes, every time I looked up, someone was staring at me. Not in a kind way, either. It felt hungry. I leaned toward Mia and whispered, "Are you sure your family's okay with me being here?" She frowned. "What do you mean? They love having guests." I wanted to brush it off as just my imagination, but then Lucas handed me a plate of mashed potatoes. His hand brushed mine, and it was ice cold. "Eat," he said, his voice low and flat. "You'll need your strength." I laughed nervously and set the plate down without taking a bite. The room seemed quieter now. Everyone was still eating, but the clinking of forks and knives sounded distant, like I was underwater. Then the questions started. "So Kayla," Mia's dad said, his fork hovering over his plate, "do your parents know you're here?" Yeah," I lied. "They know I'm spending the night." "Good," he said, his smile tightening. "It's better that way." I glanced at Mia, but she was focused on her plate, her face unreadable. Her grandmother leaned forward, her cloudy eyes locked onto mine. "Do you know why we celebrate Thanksgiving, dear?" I nodded cautiously. "To give thanks?" Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Exactly. But gratitude must be shown through sacrifice. Don't you agree?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching along the walls like fingers. Mia's mom stood up abruptly, holding a carving knife. "Shall we begin?" My stomach dropped. "Begin what?" I said, my voice shaking. No one answered. Instead, they all turned to look at me. Every single one of them. "Mia, what's going on?" I reached for her arm. She didn't look at me. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Her mother took a step toward me, the knife glinting in the candlelight. "It's nothing personal, dear. We're just so grateful you could join us." That's when I bolted. I pushed my chair back, knocking it over, and ran for the door. Behind me, I heard the table scrape against the floor as they stood up in unison. "Don't let her leave!" someone shouted. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling onto the front porch. The cold night air burned my lungs as I sprinted to my car. When I looked back, they were all standing on the porch, watching me. All of them, perfectly still, their faces blank. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road. The next day, I tried calling Mia, but her number was disconnected. When I drove back to her house, the long gravel driveway led to an empty lot. No house, no family, just trees. And a single wooden table rotting in the weeds. It was Thanksgiving night, and the house was full. My parents, grandparents, and cousins all crowded around the table, laughing, eating, and telling the same stories we'd heard 100 times before. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the windows of our old house. I was the first to hear the knock. It was faint at first, almost inaudible beneath the chatter and clatter of silverware. I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. "Did you hear that?" I said, looking around the room. "No one's going out in this weather," my dad said, brushing it off. "It's probably just the wind." But the knocking came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Dad sighed, annoyed, and pushed back his chair. "I hear it. I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the counter. I followed him to the door, my stomach tight with unease. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the front steps. Dad unlocked the door and opened it, just a crack. There was no one there. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying dried leaves across the empty driveway. Dad shook his head. "Probably just some stupid kids playing a prank," he muttered, shutting the door and bolting it. We went back to the table, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone was quieter now, glancing toward the front door like they expected it to happen again. And it did. This time, the knock was harder, more forceful, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted to make sure we heard it. Dad stood up again, but Mom grabbed his arm. "Don't open it," she said firmly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, I'll just check the cameras." Dad had installed security cameras around the house a few years back, and he pulled up the feed on his phone. We all crowded around him as he cycled through the angles. The front porch camera showed nothing but the swaying trees. Same with the driveway and the backyard. Then he switched to the side yard. I felt my blood run cold. There was a man standing just outside the camera's range. His face was in shadow, but his outline was unmistakable. He was tall, thin, and completely still. "What is going on?" Dad muttered, zooming in. The man didn't move. He just stood there, half hidden by the side of the house, as if he knew exactly where the camera's blind spot was. "Call the police," Mom whispered. Dad nodded and handed her his phone. "Everyone stay inside," grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer. But before anyone could stop him, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the kids started screaming. Someone fumbled for a flashlight, but in the chaos, I heard it again. The knocking. Only now, it wasn't just at the front door. It was at the windows, the back door, the walls. It sounded like it came from everywhere all at once. The flashlight clicked on, and we were all huddled together in the living room. Dad held the knife tightly, his eyes darting to the shadowy windows. Mom was on the phone with 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. Then the knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. We held our breath, waiting, listening. That's when we heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. We froze. No one had gone upstairs all night. "Everyone stay here," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. He handed me the flashlight and crept toward the staircase. "Don't go," Mom hissed, but he ignored her. We watched as his shadow disappeared up the stairs. The seconds stretched into minutes. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows. Then finally we heard him coming back downstairs. "Dad?" I called out, my voice trembling. But when he stepped into the light, I saw his face. It wasn't Dad. It looked like him, sure. Same clothes, same face, but his eyes were wrong. Cold, empty. "Let's finish dinner," he said, his voice flat and unnatural. No one moved. He tilted his head, smiling too wide. "What's wrong?" Behind him, the real Dad stumbled down the stairs, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "Run!" he shouted. The thing in front of us turned, its smile fading. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We grabbed the kids and bolted out the back door, running into the freezing night. When the police arrived, the house was empty. No sign of the man. No sign of whatever had come downstairs. But every year since on Thanksgiving night, we hear the same knocking, and we never, ever answer.